Social competence. Background. Primate researcher Hans Kummer once observed a female baboon spend 20 minutes slowly moving over a short 2-meter distance while remaining in a seated position. She inched over to a location behind a rock, and when she finally arrived there, she began to groom a young subordinate male. This action is one that would not have been permitted by the dominant male who was resting nearby. Kummer observed that from the vantage point of the dominant male, because of the rock, only the back of the female could be seen, and thus the illicit behavior went unnoticed. Why did the female move to a location behind the rock? It is possible that over time, she learned that engaging in behaviors while near large solid objects like rocks did not result in threatening behavior from the dominant male. Alternatively, it is possible that she recognized that the dominant male would not be able to see her actions behind the rock, and thus he would be unaware of them, allowing her to groom in safety. These options represent two different cognitive processes, yet both result in the female's effective navigation of her social environment. These processes have been the focus of research attention for the last 3 decades, for the last 30 years. For example, in 1978, Premack and Woodruff posed the question, does the chimpanzee have a theory of mind? By which they meant, like humans, does the chimpanzee interpret the behavior of others in terms of mental states such as goals, intentions, desires, or even beliefs? This can be a very difficult question to answer. How can one conclude that the behavior experimenters are observing is the result of an animal attending to patterns of behavior and creating associations that allow for prediction of future action, e.g., grooming a subordinate behind a large rock does not lead to violence, or that animals are going beyond the surface characteristics of an action and positing an underlying mental state, e.g., grooming behavior cannot be seen if we are behind a large object. It is a challenge to design experimental methods that allow for this distinction. Strong conclusions are difficult to make, and disagreements among researchers frequently arise. Inherent to the examples above is another challenge of living within a group, keeping track of the relative social rank of others and yourself. The female baboon's grooming behavior would likely have looked much different if she was intending to groom the dominant male. She must have recognized something about the difference between the two males, and how she did it is a focus of active research. Did she need to see direct interactions between the dominant and subordinate males to learn their relationship? Or were there separate interactions with other males informative enough for the female to create a representation of her group's hierarchy? Chapter plan. Most animal species live in social groups, and social living results in particular cognitive challenges that must be overcome in order to interact effectively. This chapter examines these social cognitive processes. The majority of this chapter will focus on the manner in which animals interpret the behavior of others. The research is ongoing, and debates among researchers will not likely abate anytime soon. The chapter begins by examining the detection of social, animate entities, and then considers the understanding of others' intentions, perception, and knowledge. Then, there will be consideration of another fundamental aspect of effective social interaction, understanding of the social group structure in terms of relations and hierarchies. There are other topics that one might consider integral to group living, such as social learning, cooperation, and communication. Given the depth and extent of experimentation and theorizing in these areas, they will be discussed in separate chapters. Detection of animacy. The detection of animacy would seem a basic, foundational ability for the ability to interact in a social environment. Recognizing conspecifics, predators, and prey is critical for adaptive behavior. For example, dark spot detectors in the frog retina are cells that respond to stimuli that have the characteristics of small flying insects, prey for the frog. Upon their excitation, and with information from other areas regarding the speed, distance, and direction of the movement, the frog jumps after the insect. This section will focus on 2 other, more complex systems that are important for the differentiation of animate biological entities from inanimate objects in the environment: biological motion and face perception. There are likely other important characteristics that humans and animals use to categorize the animate world from the inanimate world, e.g. self-propulsion, presence of morphological features such as hair, contingent reactivity, etc. We focus here on these two because of their history of comparative theory and research, and because of the connections that have been made to social cognition in general. Biological motion. The movement of animals, particularly vertebrates, is in most cases non-rigid, yet it is constrained by the configuration of the body and gravity itself. Biological motion offers an abundance of information to the adult human observer. Individuals can extract information regarding species classification, gender, attractiveness, and emotion from how something moves. Intriguingly, humans do so even when the motion is shown in simple point light displays, created by depicting the movements of individual joints with single lights, effectively producing an animation of movement. These displays convey biological motion in the absence of key morphological features like faces, skin, or hair. The perception is robust and so fast that fewer than 200 milliseconds of motion is sufficient to identify a point-light human walker. The efficiency of this ability has suggested to researchers that the detection of biological motion is a fundamental process that is part of an early developing and evolutionarily endowed mechanism shared across species. As such, there has been an interest in examining biological motion detection from a comparative and human developmental perspective. For example, early research demonstrated that by 4 months of age, human infants distinguish upright from inverted human point-light walkers and show a preference to attend to the former. Even infants as young as 2 days old differentiate between biological and random motion point-light displays and look longer at biological motion, even when the displays depict non-human animate motion, i.e. that of a chick. Figure 10.1. Examples of point light displays. The top row depicts frames from a movie of a walking point light hen, biological motion display. The middle and bottom rows depict random, non-biological, and inverted point light displays, respectively. Humans are not the only animals to show this precocious ability to detect biological motion. Newly hatched chicks prefer to attend to point light animations of a walking adult hen as compared to a depiction of random motion. One might be tempted to assume that the attention to biological motion was based on an innate template for hen motion instead of biological motion in general. However, this was dismissed by a second experiment in which the chicks were shown a point light display of a cat and a display of non-biological motion. The chicks showed an attentional preference for the cat. This ability to recognize and preferentially attend to the motion of biological entities has been hypothesized to underlie developing social cognition. At least in the case of humans, early differentiation of animate entities and attention toward them may provide necessary opportunities for learning about others' actions, goals, and later, beliefs. That is, by closely attending to those entities around it that are alive, an organism is provided with important experiences which can guide learning. Indeed, similar hypotheses have been presented in regard to face perception. Faces. Northern mockingbirds populate trees around the University of Florida campus in Gainesville, Florida, and females will defend their nests from intruders by swooping out of the nest while engaging in alarm calls and attacks. Figure 10.2. Levy and colleagues at the university were interested in whether mockingbirds would learn to distinguish humans who approach their nest posing a threat. Over 4 consecutive days, a human intruder approached a nest and stood for 30 seconds. For 15 of these seconds, he or she placed a hand on the rim of the nest. A total of 10 intruders engaged in this activity, each at a different nest. The female mockingbirds flushed from their nests toward the approaching intruder increasingly faster as the days progressed. Then, on the 5th day, a new person approached the nest, acting just as the original intruder had. Now, mockingbirds reacted exactly the same way they did on the first day with the original intruder, as if the second person was novel to them. Together, these results suggest that over the 4 days, and with only 30 seconds of exposure each day, The birds very quickly came to distinguish and identify the particular human who approached their nest and learned that he or she was an intruder, a finding made all the more surprising considering just how many other students in this busy campus walked in the vicinity of the nest on their normal treks to class. It is likely that the mockingbirds used the recognition of individual features, possibly within the face, to identify and distinguish intruders from other humans. This conclusion is supported by two subsequent studies, one in which wild American crows directed vocal scolding toward facial masks that had been worn by intruders even when they were worn by new people, and one in which wild magpies learned to recognize intruders even when hairstyle, hair color, skin color, height, and walking style were controlled as tightly as possible. Faces are good predictors of the presence of an animate social entity, predator, prey, or conspecific, provide identifying information for individuals, and provide informative cues regarding underlying emotional states. This section expands on the earlier discussion of social categorization in Chapter 9, highlighting some of the growing body of research and theory on the perception of faces and emotion reading in animals. This is an area of study in which many researchers are interested in comparisons with human abilities, and thus the work with animals has often focused on non-human primates. Perceiving and discriminating faces. Human newborns look longer at and orient more toward images of faces, both real and schematic versions, than non-face patterns. This suggests that a specialized cognitive system is in place and working very early in life. One candidate system, ConSpec, has been proposed by Morden and Johnson, 1991. This visual system in the brain works through innately specified parameters that orient the newborn to face-like patterns. The purpose of the system is to maximize the amount of input regarding faces that can be obtained during the first months of life, after which a second system, ConLearn, becomes active and allows for further learning about the characteristics of conspecifics. This may sound a little like the proposals made for the early orientation toward displays of biological motion. In fact, researchers have used the ConSpec-ConLearn models as analogies to explain the early attention to and learning about biological motion. A similar system, they argue, may be in place for motion as for faces. There has been a simultaneous interest in early face perception in non-human primates. If the systems proposed for humans are advantageous adaptations for social living species, they might also be in other social primate species. For example, similar to humans, is there a system that orients individuals to faces from very early in development? Further, how does face perception develop over time? Sugita, 2008, tested a group of rhesus macaque monkeys that had never seen a human or monkey face, or even a picture of a schematic of one. This was achieved by raising monkeys apart from each other and having the human caregivers wear masks while interacting. Figure 10.3. In a preferential-looking procedure, these monkeys looked longer at black and white faces, both human and other macaques, over non-face objects that were also novel, e.g. cars, houses, clocks. Thus, it is likely that macaques possess a system, possibly innate, that orients them to the characteristics of faces. Figure 10.3. Stimuli and procedure in Sugita, 2008. Rhesus macaques were raised without exposure to human faces, though had exposure to toys and decorations. Later, they were exposed to human caregivers who did not wear a mask. Interestingly, monkeys in a control group who had received normal exposure to faces, which consisted mostly of the faces of monkeys in their captive group, also showed a preference for faces, but only for the monkey faces. They preferred the faces of conspecifics over the non-face objects and over the faces of humans. Perhaps then, exposure to faces affects face processing by tuning it to the types of faces that are most prevalent in the environment. A further experiment followed up this finding. The monkeys who had been deprived of face stimuli were given 1 month of exposure to either human or monkey faces. After this period, they still showed a preference to attend to face stimuli, but only to the types of faces to which they had been exposed. For example, if they had been exposed to human faces, they looked longer at human faces than objects, but they looked at monkey faces for the same amount of time as non-face objects. These findings are consistent with perceptual narrowing, a process by which experiences with certain stimuli result in a system that is tuned to those features, allowing for increased recognition and distinctions within those stimuli as compared to other stimuli. Human infants show a similar process. Pascalis and colleagues, for example, found that 6- and 9-month-old infants recognized and distinguished among human faces, but only the younger group could also do so with a set of monkey faces. This suggests that the face system becomes tuned via experience to human faces between 6 and 9 months of age. Humans effectively lose the ability to easily distinguish among non-human faces without adequate exposure, presumably to gain expertise with those of their own species. There is suggestion that perceptual narrowing for faces exists in species beyond humans and macaws, including chimpanzees and sheep. Indeed, these abilities may have played an integral role in the development of social structures that are based on relationships between individuals, in which attention to individuals is important. The findings from perceptual narrowing studies are also interesting in light of the interspecies facial discrimination that appears to be occurring for mockingbirds, crows, and magpies in the research presented earlier. If mockingbird face processing, for example, was tuned to conspecific faces, how would they make such a discrimination among humans? This is an area of future research, but there are a few possibilities. Perhaps face perceptual tuning does not occur in mockingbirds. These mockingbirds live in an urban system in which humans are prevalent, and perhaps their systems are tuned for humans as well. The faces of the intruders were learned over the exposure trials, just as adult humans can learn to distinguish, say, monkey faces. In any case, the propensity of animals to attend to faces and to recognize and distinguish among individuals would seem to be fundamental for social species. See Box 10.1 for a consideration of the ability to recognize oneself. Box 10.1 Mirror Self-Recognition. In the 1970s, Gallup conducted a series of studies with the aim of determining whether chimpanzees have a sense of self, which he proposed was fundamental to also understanding the mental states of others. To test this, chimpanzees were observed for 10 days after a mirror was placed in their enclosure. Upon first seeing the mirror, chimpanzees often responded to their own image as if it were another chimpanzee. They would threaten it, greet it, and engage in other social responses. Over the course of a few days, though, they began to decrease their social responses and increase self-directed responses, such as grooming parts of their body that they could not otherwise see. These observations suggested that chimpanzees recognized that the image in the mirror corresponded with their own bodies, figure 10.5. To further test this interpretation, Gallup designed the mark test. While the chimpanzees were anesthetized, they were marked on one eyebrow and one ear with an odorless, colorful dye. After recovering from the anesthesia, the chimpanzees were observed for 30 minutes, during which they were without access to a mirror. When the mirror was placed back in the enclosure, chimpanzees observed themselves and touched and rubbed the marks, something they had not done before the mirror was available. Chimpanzees appeared to recognize themselves in the mirror and through this, learned about the presence of the marks on their bodies. Interestingly, unlike the chimpanzees, rhesus monkeys did not pass the mark test. Gallup interpreted the data as indicating that chimpanzees have a self-concept, which caught the attention of quite a few critics. First, many criticized the use of the term self-concept. Some researchers were hesitant to consider it as akin to humans' self-concept, complete with a sense of uniqueness, dispositions, and mortality. Others thought it more appropriate to conclude that the chimps were simply responding to an interesting image that had movement patterns that correlated with their own. This interpretation, in turn, seemed a bit flawed as it still required chimpanzees to be aware of their own body movements. At the very least, many researchers agreed that chimpanzees show self-perception, matching between kinesthesis and vision, instead of self-conception, meaning that they recognize their own bodies in the mirror, but might not have a concept of self that is similar to our own. In recent years, many different species have been tested and new methodologies have been used, which have suggested that the number of species that show mirror self-recognition may be greater than previously assumed, and that, in some cases, the mark test is not an appropriate test of self-recognition. Particularly relevant to this chapter, though, is the fact that Gallup originally proposed that passing the mark test is also indicative of having a conception of others, particularly of others' mental states. The link here is a bit tenuous, however. As will be seen in this chapter, researchers are still actively debating whether chimpanzees or any other species interpret the behavior of others in terms of mental states. Figure 10.4, facial expression matched to sample task based on PAR 2003. An image of a scream face could be matched to another scream face, but not a play face. Figure 10.5, mark test with chimpanzees based on Pavanelli and Proust 1995 and Pavanelli et al. 1999. In the top row, social and self-directed responses to initial mirror exposure are graphed. In the bottom row, responses to marked and unmarked areas of the face during the mark test are graphed. Oh wow, so it's true. So in the beginning of the days, they have more social responses to the mirror image, and then the self-directed responses go up and the social responses attenuate. Okay, and when they can see the mirror, while they do touch their face way more,